It was a regular day in the quiet town of Wilmington, North Carolina, a place where time seemed to move a little slower. Michael Jordan, the iconic basketball legend, stepped out of his sleek black car, the familiar scent of the air bringing him back to his childhood. But little did he know, the past he thought he'd left behind was about to rush back at him in a way he'd never imagined. There, in a small diner, was someone who had once shaped his world. Someone he hadn't seen in decades, and now she was struggling just to make ends meet. This was a moment of reckoning. What Michael would do next would not only change his life, but hers as well. Michael Jordan's return to his hometown, a journey to rediscover the past. Michael Jordan's arrival in Wilmington, North Carolina, wasn't a grand event. It wasn't the spotlight of a championship game or a charity gala with flashing cameras. No, this time it was different. At 62 years old, Michael returned to his hometown, not as the global icon the world knew, but as the man he once was, a young boy with dreams bigger than the small town he came from. As he stepped out of his sleek black car, the streets that once felt so ordinary now spoke volumes. The air, thick with the smell of nostalgia, pulled him back to a time when life was simpler and the future seemed far away. His hometown had always been a place of humble beginnings, where the hustle and bustle of fame hadn't yet touched the streets. It was here, among the familiar faces and landmarks, that Michael's story had truly started. But time, as it does with everyone, had shifted the world around him. The sidewalks, the old diner on the corner, the little shops, everything had aged, just as he had. Still, he couldn't help but be drawn to this place, the very town that shaped him, the town where his journey began. That evening, after a long day spent teaching young kids how to dribble, shoot, and dream, hunger gnawed at him. He had planned on dining at a high-end restaurant, a place where only the elite gathered, but as fate would have it, the restaurant was closed for a private event. In that moment, Michael wasn't the basketball legend or the successful businessman. He was simply a man, hungry for more than just food. He needed a sense of belonging, a taste of the past that would remind him of the values and lessons he had learned in the early days of his life. Walking down the familiar streets, Michael's steps led him to a place that could only be described as home, the kind of place that didn't require reservations or exclusivity. Betty's place. The name alone evoked memories of warmth and comfort, the kind of small-town diner that had been a staple for decades. Michael stood before the weathered sign, and without thinking, he walked inside. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, the smell of greasy fries and sizzling burgers filling the air. The diner was modest, its red vinyl booths well worn, and the flickering jukebox in the corner added a touch of nostalgia. It was exactly what Michael needed. A simple meal in a familiar setting. No glitz, no glam, just comfort. Just home. The waitress who approached his table looked like any other small-town worker, focused on her task, her back turned as she took orders and refilled coffee cups. Michael sat back in the booth, scanning the menu. His stomach growled, but his mind wandered. The quiet of the diner gave him a rare moment of peace, a break from the endless calls and emails that came with being a global icon. For once, there were no cameras, no crowds, just him and his thoughts. And then, as the waitress turned, something inside Michael stopped. The moment his eyes met hers, the world seemed to pause. Time slowed down. He could hardly believe it. There, standing in front of him, was the very woman who had shaped his childhood. The woman who had been there for him when his parents couldn't be. The woman who had bandaged his scraped knees, held him close when he was scared, and believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. Miss Evelyn. She stood before him, now an elderly woman, with white hair tied back in a bun and wrinkles etched deep into her face. But those warm brown eyes, they hadn't changed a bit. They were the same eyes that had looked at him with so much love and care, eyes that had once told him everything would be okay, even when he thought nothing would ever go right. And now, those same eyes widened with shock, recognition dawning in them as she realized who was sitting in front of her. "Little Michael? Michael Jordan?" she asked, her voice quivering, disbelief and joy mixing together. In that moment, the years between them disappeared. All the time that had passed, all the changes that had come with fame and fortune, none of it mattered. What mattered was that this was the woman who had believed in him when he was just a boy with big dreams and small means. She had seen the potential in him when the world had yet to recognize it, and now she was standing before him, working hard at the age of 85, just trying to make ends meet. It was impossible for Michael to ignore the crushing realization that the woman who had given him so much love and care, who had shaped him into who he was still working, still struggling, and in that instant, he knew that he couldn't walk away. Not without doing something to change her life. In the midst of all the fame, success, and wealth Michael had achieved, there was one lesson that had stayed with him. True greatness isn't just about what you accomplish for yourself. It's about lifting up others. Miss Evelyn had done that for him when he was young. Now it was his turn. And in that moment a spark was lit. A plan began to form in his mind, one that would change both of their lives forever. This was no longer just a reunion. This was a call to action, a reminder that sometimes the most meaningful way to honor your past is to change someone's future. A reunion with Miss Evelyn, the past that shaped Michael Jordan. When Michael Jordan looked up and saw Miss Evelyn standing before him, it was as if the years fell away, leaving nothing but the raw connection of a shared history. In that moment, time wasn't defined by the clock or the number of years that had passed. It was defined by the bond that still lingered in the air between them. A bond that was so much deeper than words could convey. For Michael, it wasn't just a reunion with an old acquaintance. It was a rediscovery of something far more profound, a piece of his soul that had been shaped by this woman, and by the life lessons she had instilled in him during his most formative years. Miss Evelyn wasn't just his nanny. She was a constant presence in his life, a guiding force through his childhood, a woman who had seen him at his most vulnerable and had always believed in him, even when he couldn't believe in himself. She had been there when he had scraped his knees from his rough play, when his heart had been bruised by rejection, and when his young dreams had seemed too large for the world to contain. Her presence was more than that of a caretaker. She was a silent architect of his character. The love and discipline she instilled in him formed the foundation upon which he built his identity. And yet, in that moment, she stood before him, frail and weathered, wearing the same tired uniform she had worn for years, serving burgers and coffee to strangers. A woman who had poured so much love into others was now struggling to survive, working at an age when most people should be resting, enjoying the fruits of a long life. As Michael's eyes studied her, he couldn't help but be struck by the contrast, the strength she had once shown in her youth, the tenderness in her touch as she guided him through the small challenges of life, and the vulnerability of the woman before him now. Her hands, once strong and steady, now trembled slightly as she carried plates to the tables, her movements slower, her steps labored. Her bright eyes, still full of warmth, now held a quiet sadness that seemed to seep from her every pore. It was the same woman who had chased him around the yard, who had tamed his wild spirit with patience, and who had believed in him long before anyone else had. And yet here she was, still working long hours in a diner to make ends meet. Michael felt a deep pang of guilt. How had he let this happen? How had he, the man who had accomplished so much, allowed the woman who had shaped his life to live in these conditions? He had never stopped to think about her after he had moved on to greater things. In the whirlwind of his career, his fame, and his wealth, he had forgotten the people who had helped him along the way, the ones who had given him everything they had without asking for anything in return. As Michael watched her, he was flooded with memories of his childhood. Memories of a time when the world seemed much smaller, when love and guidance were given freely and without hesitation. Miss Evelyn had been there for him, not just as a caretaker, but as a source of wisdom and strength. She had shown him how to tie his shoes, how to believe in himself when he felt like quitting, and how to find joy in the little things. She had shared stories with him, stories of resilience, hope, and perseverance that had laid the groundwork for the mindset he carried with him throughout his career. Now, seeing her in front of him, working tirelessly to make a living, Michael felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude mixed with sorrow. Gratitude for everything she had done for him, for the lessons she had taught him, and for the unwavering support she had given him, but also sorrow. Sorrow for the fact that this woman, who had given so much of herself to others, had never received the same in return. How had he, with all of his success, failed to recognize the need to give back to those who had shaped him? It was in this moment that something deep within Michael stirred. He couldn't just sit back and let this continue. He couldn't walk away from the woman who had played such a pivotal role in his life, who had given him so much, and now was living in a way that didn't reflect the love and care she had shown him. Michael knew that he couldn't change the past, but he had the power to change the future. His heart sank as he looked at her, still serving customers with a smile, despite the pain that was visible in her every movement. He had everything: wealth, fame, accolades, and yet none of it mattered if he couldn't give back to the person who had helped him become who he was today. This was more than a chance encounter. This was a reckoning. For Michael, it became clear that the true measure of a man is not found in the trophies he wins or the money he earns, but in the way he impacts the lives of others. Ms. Evelyn had impacted his life in ways that words could never capture, and now it was his turn to impact hers. He didn't know exactly what he would do yet, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to walk away from this. He wasn't going to let this woman, this incredible woman who had sacrificed so much for him and for others, continue to live a life of struggle. He would find a way to change her future, just as she had once changed his. And so Michael Jordan sat there, in that small diner, a man of wealth and fame, but in that moment he was simply a man who had been given a second chance to honor the woman who had shaped his life. And he knew that he couldn't let her down. The lessons she had taught him were not just about basketball. They were about life, about gratitude, about love, and about never forgetting the people who helped us along the way. Miss Evelyn's struggles, the unseen life of service and sacrifice. As Michael sat in the booth, watching Miss Evelyn move from table to table, carrying heavy plates with the kind of grace that only comes from a lifetime of doing something out of sheer necessity, his heart grew heavy with a sense of sadness he hadn't expected. He had remembered her as a strong, ever-present figure from his childhood, someone who had been there for him in ways his parents couldn't always be, offering not just care but wisdom and love. But now, in the quiet hum of the diner, he realized just how much time had eroded her body and spirit. The woman who had once been the embodiment of strength was now frail, her steps slow and deliberate, each movement a reminder of the years of labor that had shaped her existence. Ms. Evelyn had spent a lifetime giving. She had poured herself into others, never asking for much in return, never expecting anything but a simple thank you for her work. But now, watching her serve others with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, Michael felt the weight of her unspoken story. The story of a woman who had given everything, and yet had received so little. She had worked for his family when he was a child, taking care of him and his siblings with the devotion of a mother. She had been the one who made sure he was fed, safe, and loved, even when the world outside felt uncertain. Her sacrifices had been countless, and her kindness immeasurable. She had been more than just a nanny. She had been a constant, a stable presence in a world that often felt chaotic. Yet now, at 85 years old, Miss Evelyn was still working. She wasn't just serving meals at Betty's place for the simple joy of it. She was doing it because, as she had said, bills don't pay themselves. It was a quiet admission of the struggle she had faced for years. Despite having worked countless jobs throughout her life, from nanny to housekeeper to cafeteria worker, she had never been able to escape the cycle of hard labor. And now, her body was telling the tale of those decades. Her hands, once steady, now shook with the weight of arthritis. Her back, once strong, now bowed with the years of service. The woman who had taught him to believe in his dreams, to work hard, and to never give up, was now carrying the weight of her own years in silence. She had never complained. She had never asked for help. Even when the burden grew too heavy, she had simply kept going, her resilience a quiet force that carried her through the hardest of times. But Michael could see the toll it had taken on her, the exhaustion that seemed to hang over her like a cloud, the weariness in her eyes that even her best smile couldn't disguise. As he watched her serve food to the customers, Michael couldn't help but think of the countless sacrifices she had made for him and his family. Miss Evelyn had always put others first, even when it meant neglecting her own needs. She had raised her children with the same selflessness, working multiple jobs to make sure they had everything they needed. And now, when her children were grown and had their own families, she was still here, still working, still struggling. Michael couldn't fathom the weight of her life, the struggles she had endured, and the dreams she had put aside to care for others. She had raised him, shaped him, and believed in him when he had been nothing more than a boy with dreams. She had seen potential in him when no one else had, and now she was still serving others, despite the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. As he thought about it, Michael realized just how much he owed to her, not just for the care she had given him, but for the life lessons she had imparted. Lessons about resilience, hard work, and the importance of never giving up, no matter how difficult life became. But he also realized that he couldn't allow her to continue down this path. He couldn't stand by and watch the woman who had shaped his life continue to struggle. It was in that moment that Michael made a silent vow to himself. He would do whatever it took to change her life, to give her the rest she deserved, to repay her for the countless years she had given to others, never once asking for anything in return. The world knew him as a legend on the basketball court, but in that moment, he knew that true greatness wasn't measured in points scored or championships won. It was measured in the impact we have on the lives of those who have helped shape us, and Miss Evelyn had shaped his life in more ways than he could count. Michael's heart ached as he watched her move between tables, never slowing down, never complaining. She was a woman who had lived a life of service, and it was time for her to rest. It was time for her to receive the care and love she had given so freely to others. The thought of her continuing to work in this diner, struggling to make ends meet at 85, filled him with a sense of urgency. He couldn't walk away from this. He couldn't leave her here, alone and exhausted. He had to act. As Miss Evelyn brought him his check, Michael knew that he had to make a decision, not just for her, but for himself. He had to do what was right. He had to repay her, not just with words, but with action. And in that moment, Michael knew that this encounter, this reunion, was not just a chance meeting. It was a call to change a life. Her life. And he wouldn't let her down. Michael's heartfelt decision, a vow to change her life. As Michael sat in the dimly lit diner, the weight of the moment pressed upon him like never before. What had started as an ordinary visit to his hometown had quickly become something far more profound. He had come seeking solace, a simple meal to break away from the chaos of his world. But what he found was a woman who had once poured so much love into his life, now struggling just to survive. Ms. Evelyn, his childhood nanny, was still working at 85, carrying the weight of a lifetime of sacrifices with every step. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. This was no longer just a moment of reconnection. This was a moment of reckoning. Michael had achieved so much in his life. He had reached the pinnacle of success in basketball, amassed wealth and fame, and traveled the world. Yet none of it felt as significant in that instant as the realization that the woman who had shaped him, nurtured him, and believed in him all those years ago was still laboring in a diner, far removed from the life of comfort and rest that she had so richly earned. In his mind, the question echoed relentlessly. How could he have let this happen? How had he allowed the woman who had been a second mother to him, the one who had believed in his dreams before anyone else, to slip into such a life of struggle? He had seen the signs, the way her hands trembled with the weight of arthritis, the way her back hunched with the burden of decades spent working tirelessly to make ends meet. But it wasn't just the physical toll that struck him the hardest. It was the quiet dignity with which she carried herself, the smile that never seemed to fade, even when her eyes betrayed the pain she carried. She had never asked for help, never complained, never shown weakness. She had simply kept moving, kept giving, and kept loving. And Michael, despite everything he had achieved, had never thought to give back to her in the way she truly deserved. Now, as he watched Miss Evelyn continue to serve customers with a grace that belied her years, Michael felt a deep, aching sorrow in his chest. He realized that, in all his years of playing basketball and building his empire, he had failed to see the people who had truly mattered, the ones who had helped him along the way, the ones who had quietly shaped his character. Miss Evelyn was one of those people. She had been his rock when the world was uncertain, offering love, care, and guidance when he needed it most. And now she was in desperate need of something she had never asked for: help. A quiet resolve began to form within him. Michael's mind raced with possibilities, but his heart knew what needed to be done. This wasn't just about money. It was about giving her the peace and comfort she had so willingly given to others. It was about honoring her sacrifices, not just through words, but through action. He couldn't walk away from this. He couldn't simply slip back into his life, leaving Miss Evelyn behind in the same struggles she had faced for years. He had been given so much in his life, and now it was time to give back. Michael had always prided himself on being a man of action, someone who didn't just talk about making a difference, but someone who followed through. And in that moment, he knew that the legacy he had built on the basketball court, the fame and fortune he had accumulated, meant little compared to the legacy of kindness, gratitude, and service that he now wanted to leave behind. He wanted to be the person who made a difference in someone else's life, just as Miss Evelyn had done for him. As he finished his meal and the waitress brought him his check, Michael made a silent vow. He would not let her struggle any longer. He would find a way to ensure that Miss Evelyn would never have to work another day in her life. The woman who had devoted her years to serving others, who had sacrificed her own happiness for the sake of her children and the people she cared for, deserved the chance to rest, to enjoy the fruits of her labor, to live her final years with the comfort and dignity she had earned. With the quiet determination that had defined his basketball career, Michael paid the check and left a generous tip, ensuring that Miss Evelyn wouldn't know the full extent of his gesture until after he had gone. But that wasn't enough. He knew that he had to do more. He had to take real action to change her life, to show her that she was worthy of something greater than the life she had lived. He called his driver and waited for Miss Evelyn to finish her shift. The sound of the diner's doorbell jingled once more, signaling her departure from the life she had known for so long. As they walked together to the car, Michael couldn't help but notice the way she hesitated at the sight of the luxury vehicle, her eyes wide with awe. It was a stark contrast to the worn-out station wagon she had driven him in all those years ago, but despite the differences in their lives, Michael was determined to bridge that gap, to right the wrongs of the past, and ensure that Miss Evelyn never had to face another day of hardship. As the car pulled away from the curb, Michael looked at Miss Evelyn, her tired hands resting in her lap, her eyes gazing out at the world that had once felt so familiar, yet now seemed so distant. In that moment, Michael knew that his purpose was clear. He wasn't just going to offer her comfort. He was going to offer her a future, one where she could finally relax, enjoy her life, and know that she had made a lasting difference in the world. And so, with a heart full of gratitude and a mind set on action, Michael Jordan made a vow to change her life for good. He would ensure that Miss Evelyn, the woman who had given him so much, would finally be able to enjoy the peace she deserved. This was no longer just a reunion, it was a turning point, a moment of redemption, and Michael's chance to repay a debt that could never truly be paid in full. But he would try, because she had done the same for him, time and time again. A new beginning, the promise of change and gratitude. As Michael Jordan sat beside Miss Evelyn in the back of the car, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility settle in his chest. The car glided silently through the streets of Wilmington, each passing moment marking the distance between the life Miss Evelyn had lived for so many years and the future that Michael knew he was about to help create for her. As the city faded into the distance, Michael's thoughts turned inward, reflecting on the incredible sacrifices that had shaped her life and the quiet dignity with which she had carried those burdens. Evelyn's life had been a tapestry of struggle and selflessness, woven together with threads of love, hope, and perseverance. She had worked tirelessly, without hesitation, to provide for her family, to care for others, and to make sure that the children she watched over, including Michael, had everything they needed to succeed. She had never sought recognition or reward for the countless hours she spent cleaning, cooking, and comforting, believing that her service was its own reward. And yet, now after all those years of giving, she was still working, still laboring at a time in life when most would have been enjoying their well-earned rest. As the car drove further into the town, Michael couldn't shake the guilt that weighed heavily on his heart. He had taken so much for granted, never fully understanding the depth of Evelyn's sacrifices. The childhood memories that he had held so dear, the days when she had comforted him after his failures and celebrated his victories, were now tinged with the bitter realization that he had failed to notice how little she had been given in return. How could he have not seen the toll her years of hard work had taken on her? How could he have let her slip through the cracks of his busy life without stepping back to offer the help she had so freely given to him? The car slowed as they neared the apartment complex where Miss Evelyn had lived for the past 15 years. The buildings were old, their paint peeling, the sidewalks cracked and uneven. The surroundings spoke of years of neglect, of life being lived in the shadows of greater aspirations. Michael could see that her apartment wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a reflection of the struggles she had endured. The modest surroundings, the outdated furniture, and the lack of luxury all told a story of a woman who had sacrificed everything for the sake of others, only to end up in a life that reflected little of the dignity she deserved. Evelyn seemed to brighten as they arrived, as if her small, humble home was the one place where she found peace, despite the many hardships it represented. She had raised her children here, poured her heart into the space, and made it her own. But as Michael followed her inside, he couldn't ignore the stark contrast between her environment and the life he had built. His home was filled with every luxury and convenience imaginable, while she had settled into a life that was constantly on the edge of survival. And yet, despite the hardships, she welcomed him with the same warmth and kindness she had always offered, making him a cup of tea, chatting about the simple joys of life, as if she had never wanted anything more than to make him feel at home. As they sat together in the modest living room, Michael felt the weight of his promise growing stronger. He had made a silent vow to change her life, to ensure that the woman who had done so much for him would never have to endure another day of unnecessary hardship. He would not let her spend her golden years in the same constant struggle she had known her whole life. He couldn't allow her to continue living in the shadows of a life that didn't reflect the love and devotion she had given to others. Evelyn had spent her entire life taking care of everyone else. Now it was time for someone to take care of her. With every conversation, every moment spent in her company, Michael grew more determined. He had seen firsthand the quiet, almost invisible struggles that had shaped her existence. The sacrifices, the missed opportunities for rest, the dreams deferred in the name of survival. All of it had come at the cost of her own happiness. Yet, even after all these years, she remained unwavering in her kindness and generosity. Michael knew that he had to act. He couldn't let this be another fleeting moment of realization, another instance where he saw the truth and did nothing. He had the resources, the influence, and the means to make a difference in her life, and he wouldn't let this chance slip by. As Evelyn spoke about her children and grandchildren, the pride in her voice was unmistakable. She had raised her family with love and devotion, and they had grown into the kind of people who made her proud. But despite the love she shared with her family, there was a quiet sadness in her words, a longing for something more, something she had always denied herself. She spoke of her children's successes, but also of the distance that had grown between them, the way time and distance had separated them, making it harder for her to connect with them as often as she'd like. It was in these moments that Michael realized just how much he had taken for granted. He had his family, his children, his success, and yet he had never truly understood the sacrifices that people like Miss Evelyn made. Now, he was determined to make sure that she would be able to enjoy the relationships and joys she had worked so hard to create without the constant worry of bills and survival hanging over her head. With every passing minute, Michael's resolve deepened. The future he envisioned for Miss Evelyn was not one of struggle and hardship, but one of peace, comfort, and the ability to enjoy the fruits of her labor. And as he left her apartment that evening, his mind was set. He would do everything in his power to give her the life she had always deserved. A life free from worry, free from struggle, a life where she could finally rest. Michael's promise to Miss Evelyn was not just about money or material things. It was about giving her the dignity she had always given to others. It was about showing her that she was loved, that her sacrifices were seen, and that she had made a lasting difference in the world. The journey of gratitude that had begun with a simple visit to his hometown was now a mission to ensure that Miss Evelyn would never have to face another day of hardship again, and Michael knew that this was the most important thing he would ever do. A future rewritten, Michael's gift to Miss Evelyn. As Michael Jordan sat with Miss Evelyn, contemplating the future he was about to help her build, He felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. The woman who had been a constant, nurturing presence in his life was now facing the struggles of old age, working tirelessly just to survive. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. The same hands that had guided him through childhood, offering love and wisdom, were now trembling under the weight of arthritis and years of hard labor, and in that moment, Michael knew he couldn't stand by and watch. He made a silent promise. He would use his success, his resources, to rewrite her story. He would give her the life she had always deserved, a life free from financial worries, filled with peace, comfort, and the freedom to rest. It wasn't just about money or grand gestures, it was about showing Miss Evelyn that the years of sacrifice she had given to others had not gone unnoticed, that the love she had poured into him and so many others would now be returned tenfold. With quiet determination, Michael began to take action. His resources would provide her with financial security, health care, and the peace of mind she had never known. But beyond that, Michael's mission was to honor her legacy of love and care by ensuring she could enjoy her family and her life in a way she had always deserved but never asked for. This moment of gratitude, of giving back, was more than just a gesture. It was a deep reflection on how we can all impact the lives of those who shaped us. Michael's actions weren't about fame or fortune. They were about paying forward the love and support he had received. His gift to Miss Evelyn was the gift of a future, and in doing so, he showed us all the true meaning of legacy. If you're moved by stories like Michael's, of real-life heroes changing the lives of those who shaped them, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and comment below with your thoughts. How have you been inspired to give back in your own life? Let's create a community of gratitude and action together.